I'm delighted that you're here. And the reason that I'm moderating is because I'm very passionate about bipartisanship. And as a member of the Aspen Institute organization, we obviously believe in getting people together. We've had a number of sessions, as you probably know by now, on conservative thinking in America. It's been incredible how many people have gone. We're not known for always being so welcoming to conservatives, which is why we wanted to make sure that people understand that we actually are. It hasn't been our reputation. These sessions have been packed. And I think it's really important that we spend time listening to all sides of arguments. And with no further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Representative Anthony Gonzalez from Ohio and Alyssa Slotkin from Michigan, who are freshmen in Congress on either side of the aisle. And how fantastic that we have two people on other opposite sides of the aisle that are actually working with one another, and we're going to get into that a little bit. I want to start by just giving you some statistics about Congress. They've only been in Congress for 6 months. You would think, given the way the House of Representatives has been talked about in the last 6 months, they've been here for years. So they're still newbies to Capitol Hill. And we elected, as American citizens, 127 to Congress this year, new. 23% of the House, almost 24% of the House, is now 102 new members of Congress. 25% are women in the Senate. I may get these statistics slightly wrong. 234 Democrats in the House, 201 Republicans. Because they're new, let's just listen a little bit about young people voting. 18 to 24-year-olds voted for Democrats, 68% to 22%. Hispanics who voted for Democrats, 69%. Share of people who never attended college who voted Republican, 51%. Share of independents who voted for Democrats, 54%. The total raised in the midterm elections for Democratic House candidates, just under $1 billion, $923 million. And I don't know if we're looking at a new wave of enthusiasm for voting or just a response to the president. You guys can get into that a little bit because you know better than I. For young people, and I'm assuming that you both appeal to young people, the top issue is economics. And this is all from a site called Statista, which I just found out about, didn't know about. So let's start. You both have, you're 32 years old, 34.
I'd love to be 32.
I would love to be 34.
Yeah. But thank you.
I'm not quite twice as old as either one of you. Yeah. It's okay. This 60 thing is okay. Yeah. So let's just start. What did both of you do before running? Just take a minute. Like, what did you do before you decided to run for Congress?
So I have a kind of a goofy background. So immediately prior, I was helping my father in his steel business. We have a steel business in Northeast Ohio. Prior to that, was running a tech company in Silicon Valley. Prior to that, MBA at Stanford. Immediately prior to that, I played in the NFL for 5 seasons with the Indianapolis Colts. So
the Colts.
I played for the Colts. I was a wide receiver and went to Ohio State. Grew up in Northeast Ohio. There we go. There we go. We got some. So it's. See, Michigan and Ohio can get along, not just Republican, Democrat, but we have all kinds of things we overcome. But yeah, so that's kind of what I was doing prior to this.
And of course, Andrew Luck is now leading the Colts, but you didn't play for him. Yeah. You played for Peyton Manning.
I did.
Who we love as a Denver Bronco fan.
Yeah, wonderful man.
So. Okay, great. And Alyssa, what did you do before?
Different background. I am a former CIA officer, former Pentagon official. I did 3 tours in Iraq alongside the military. I'm a Shia militia analyst by training. And I'm married to an Army colonel and have 2 stepdaughters, both in service. So I'm on the service side of the spectrum.
That's really incredible. Yeah. So Alyssa, what made you decide? Assistant Secretary of Defense, right? What made you decide to run for Congress?
You know, especially being married to an Army colonel, we were very apolitical. I had never gone to a political event. I had never gone to a fundraiser, and had worked for both Democrats and Republicans very proudly. And I just felt that the tenor and tone of politics in 2016 just was fundamentally unbecoming of the country that I had served and the country that we all love. It just felt different. And so I started thinking about running. Was reticent to get in because if you've never run, it is a very daunting prospect, particularly money in politics, as you just mentioned, just how do you raise money? And so I was reticent to get in, and frankly, it was healthcare, and very specifically the healthcare vote in the House to repeal protections for people with pre-existing conditions. That was very personal to me. My mom died of ovarian cancer and did not have insurance when she was diagnosed. So that was the sort of tipping point for me and got me in officially.
Can I just ask you, not knowing that, how did you end up paying for that?
We were very, very lucky. We started filling out the paperwork for her to declare bankruptcy. The same month that we were dealing with her terminal diagnosis, we came home, we moved back. I was a CIA officer, and our lives were basically exploding, and we started filling out the paperwork to declare bankruptcy. At the end, by a total and utter loophole, we were able to get her back on insurance. She was just 2 days short of the deadline in which, in the state of Michigan, they have to let you back on insurance. So we were very lucky that we were able to pay for her care. But it was just by the skin of our teeth that we did that. And if not, we would have declared bankruptcy for her, gone on Medicaid, and figured out a way to pay for her 18 months that she lived treatment.
I'm so sorry. That's incredible, though. Anthony, what made you run? Fresh graduate from Stanford.
Yeah, so
young.
similar to what Alyssa said, but really, I think a story kind of helps. So my father immigrated to this country in 1960 from Cuba and started a steel business the year before I was born, still runs it. And when I used to grow up as a kid and we would drive into downtown Cleveland, just south of the city is a giant steel plant, okay? When I was a kid, that steel plant employed 15,000 people. And my father always used to say, if you see those smokestacks and there's smoke coming out of the stacks and there's trucks on the road, you know that everything in Northeast Ohio is fine. You know, people have jobs, they can take care of their kids, they can put them to college, hopefully. And that plant, again, employed 15,000 people. Today, it's less than 1,500. And if you believe that the next 30 years are going to have a heck of a lot more change than the previous 30 years, which I do, and the economy is going to be more disruptive, and there's going to be more dislocation. I looked at my community and the country at large and said, where is this discussion happening in Washington, D.C.? Where are we having a big, robust discussion about the pace of change and the direction of our economy, and what policies do we need that kind of undergird our families, that allow a farmer in Worcester, Ohio, a steel worker in Canton, Ohio, a tech worker in Silicon Valley, wherever you are in this country, I want you to be in a position where you have all the tools you need to succeed and build a strong family in a robust and safe community. And that when I looked at the rhetoric and where we were headed as a politics, or with our politics, I just lost faith in that. And I think those are the fundamental questions. And I said, well, you know what? I'm not seeing enough of that dialogue. I can complain about it, or I can go into it myself with a fresh set of eyes and a desire to work bipartisan. Because everything I just said, I mean, we'll have partisan fights on how we solve it. But I think if we agree on the problem set, we'll probably move things forward. And that's kind of the big impetus for me was, you know, how do I do that in Congress and serve my community, but also my country?
Tell us just quickly what it was like to actually run. I just think that would be interesting. And a lot of us don't meet candidates who actually have succeeded, and you did. What were your biggest challenges?
You know, honestly, I think one of the best things that happened is that I had no idea how to do it. And so you just take, you know, a halfway intelligent person and put them against a new problem set, and you just have to figure it out. And I'm glad that I didn't have sort of someone telling me out of the corner of my, you know, saying you should do it this way, you should do it that way. I think we actually, as a country, are sort of done with the traditional talking point politician who's very polished and very prepared. There's too much reality programming. We've all sort of absorbed all that. So it was a great year to run as yourself. And so therefore, it was a joy. I enjoyed it a lot more than I thought I would. But you just start talking to everyone you know. And in a place like Michigan, it was very clear very early that political affiliation is changing. It's like a big mixing bowl. So we'd knock on someone's door and it would be like, this person's a hardcore Democrat. And they'd be like, I'm not a Democrat anymore. And then you'd go to the next house and it said, okay, this person's probably a hardcore Republican. He's like, nope, I'm independent, no way. And we realized very quickly that things were changing on the ground. So it made it a challenge, but it made it a joy, and it made me an optimist, actually. It restored my faith in people running for office because people generally, regardless of political affiliation, still share the same values. They still care about this country being a decent place and being represented by decent people. And that was very important for me to feel in real time. Mm-hmm.
What part of Michigan?
What part of Michigan is the question?
Sorry, for the Michiganders in the room, this is how we do it. It's northern suburbs of Detroit, all the way over to Lansing and Michigan State University. Go green.
How many people in your district?
Pretty much every district is about 750,000 people. So that's about that.
Great. Okay, and Anthony, what was it like for you?
Very similar. So it's not terribly dissimilar from a startup in that, I've never done this before. I had no idea what I was doing. And so you start with a couple phone calls. I mean, I called one of my best friends from college who I thought knew people in politics. I didn't know anybody in politics. And so he connected me with 3 people, which turned into, everybody had 3 more people. And before you know it, you're sitting down with your wife trying to figure out if this is right for you and your family. And then I got introduced to my chief of staff who ran my campaign. And it turns into just a full-on sprint. I mean, my NFL career actually prepared me pretty well for this component because it's so competitive. I mean, I can't make it similar to like a boxing match where you're preparing and you're working and you're doing everything all for this one day at the very end, where you hope you're victorious. And it's really all the preparation that goes into it. And so I loved that. I loved the campaign. I had a similar takeaway. I didn't know what I was going to experience on the campaign trail. I came out of this more optimistic than I've ever been in my life because people, my general take, your average voter, your median voter, does not want us to tear each other limb from limb. They do not endorse the rhetoric that they're seeing on cable news, on Twitter, in these sort of cesspools of dialogue. They want us to work together and they want us to solve problems for the country. That's where the voters are.
It is a deep dichotomy between the people on the ground and what we see in our media, in our siloed different medias. And it is deeply disturbing, I think, to be talking to people all day long. You're at 6 events, you're at supermarkets, you're at big town halls, and you're hearing from people about what they care about, and then you turn on the news, and it's like they have no idea what's going on, at least in the middle of the country.
Yeah.
They don't have any idea.
They do not have any. I can speak for my part of the country, that just north of Ohio, that the rhetoric, the tone, the vitriol, the antagonism is absolutely not what the average voter in my district and my state wants, and they can't stand it. And it became a campaign issue on my campaign. Yeah. I didn't, healthcare and prescription drug pricing are the biggest issues in my district by far, and water. But close behind that is just bringing a sense of integrity and decency back to our system. People are pulling out their hair, particularly in swing states where we were never at each other's throats. We were never polarized. My dad was a Republican, my mom was a Democrat. We fight about sports in our part of the country, not politics, but that has been imported from Washington, and people can't stand it. So I won Republican women by 14 points because they just believed that I had integrity and we were going to do things differently in Washington. The tone.
And was part of your campaign victory based on the fact that you said that I'm a different kind of politician for both of you?
100%.
Did ads on it? I mean, yes. And I didn't go into it thinking that would be a campaign issue, because you usually hear people's pocketbooks and people's kids, but they connect the spirit of civility and decency to their kids, because they don't want their kids to grow up in a country where you can't watch the news and you can't solve problems, without being vitriol throwing across the table. That's not how we teach our kids, so they don't want a government that looks like that.
That's really wonderful. Okay, so you win, and it's November, and then you come to Washington and you take orientation, and just for the benefit of people who don't really know what that period of 2 months is like, what is it like? You just had this big victory party, and you're on your way. You have to move. You have to move in. I keep hearing that congressmen bunk up and 7 in an apartment or whatever it is in expensive Washington, D.C. What's that transition like for you?
So like I was.
This is only 7 months ago, by the way.
Right. Yeah. So I was the genius who thought I was going to get like some time off after the campaign. So I'm like, oh, this is great. My wife and I, we had our first son 2 weeks before our primary, and our primary was very, very contentious. And so, we're thinking, okay, great, we're going to get some time off. Turns out that's not what happens. What actually happens is you go to DC and you have to staff up. And so there is a big race to get all the best staff back on your team. You have to keep the campaign going because we run every 2 years, and we're in competitive seats. And so,
does the House establish offices for you to do that? Because you can't exactly go
there's
into
a
that
lottery.
congressman's.
No, so they give us they give us a room that they partition into 4 areas, and so you can hear each other interviewing staffers. And
Political process. At work.
yeah,
This is
and
fun.
so it's a full-on race, and you want to build the best team, obviously. And then there's some kind of orientation bits, then back to your district, and then you get sworn in, January 3rd. And again, it's back to the races. I did finally get that vacation with my wife, but that was like a month ago, as opposed to in November when I thought it would be.
And you go to orientation, and I recall at the State of the Union, all the women were wearing white for all the women that had won. Tell me, Alyssa, tell all of us, what was it like to be part of this wave of women that were elected, and so much interest and enthusiasm for women running? I think it's the most number of women that have ever run for Congress, Senate or the House. Did you feel part of a wave?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. And I think the thing that sometimes gets lost is we have the largest number of women in any class that's ever come in. We are younger on average as a class by 15 years than the rest of Congress. That means we have the largest number of school-age children coming in, the largest number of dual-income households where both husband and wife or spouse and spouse work. There are a lot of cultural differences with our class, which is a good thing. But for every woman who won, I wish I could transport you to my campaign where the main field organizers are all women. The lion's share of our volunteers were first-time volunteers, were women. We had people coming in, grandmother, mother, daughter, all coming in. It was, for every woman who's sitting in Congress, there is a huge organization that mobilized around her with a lot of women involved, which is a fantastic thing. And especially in a district like mine, I just want to say, those are Republican women who in one of my big counties were doing all that organization for me and leading door-knocking groups out of their homes. And so I want to acknowledge that for a lot of people, they were very brave. They voted for someone and a party that they had never voted for, and that's to be lauded.
Mm-hmm. And you ran against a woman.
I did, in both my primary and my general election.
And how did that feel?
So I don't know
How do
anything
I put
else.
that? Let's
So this is my first race. So
Did you?
Similar to what Representative Slotkin said. One of the beauties about doing this for the first time, and a phrase that I had on my campaign was, "This isn't worth it if I have to be somebody else." I don't want to run as somebody else. I don't want to run as a cookie cutter politician. I want to run as myself on the ideas that I think are important for Northeast Ohio and our country. And one of the most inspiring things for me is this groundswell of support that forms around you, right? Because you've never done this before. And so you're selling your message, and you're saying what's important to you and what you want to fight for and who you want to represent. And that's going to attract people. It's going to turn some people off, but it's going to attract people. And the amount of support that we had kind of around us was just, it was incredible. And we, I mentioned my wife we had our first child 2 weeks before the primary. And the amount of support that we actually had a lot of female support as well. One of my favorite supporters is this lady named Nancy, who served in Vietnam and was a lifelong cop, and then she kind of came onto our campaign and really helped drive a lot of the grassroots support. So we had sort of a whole community around us helping us, not just on the campaign, but also as a young family trying to kind of figure out how to be parents for the first time. Mm-hmm. And the one thing I will say, the spouses are the true all-stars of this thing.
Yeah, geez.
Because it's hard for us, but it is really hard for them. Because our schedules are crazy, but also, we can take criticism. It's our name on the door, that's fine. But it's a totally different thing when your spouse is reading things and seeing things and wondering how it's affecting you and the family. So it's a really interesting thing running for politics for the first time, but one that there's a little one there, and but one that was the most gratifying experience, professional experience of my life.
So now you're in. You go through orientation. How do you get assigned to committees? Just one more lesson in civics. I'm just curious.
So that's its own race. So I assume you guys do it the same way, but we have a steering committee which is made up of leadership, and there's, I think, 25, 26 people on it, and you have to go make your pitch to the committee. Here are the committees I want to be on, and here's why I'm a good fit for them and why it's important for my community. The one I targeted was financial services because of my background running a tech company, but also my MBA. And all of the implications associated with monetary policy and trade, which is a huge issue in my district. I wanted to get on financial services. That was my target. And so we met with everybody about 5 different times, sent them little Buckeyes. They're delicious candies if you don't know what I'm talking about.
This is the leadership of the Republicans.
Leadership of the Republican Party. So the speaker and the majority leader get together and say, here are the committees and here are the seats you each have. Now Republicans, you go put your people on yours. We'll go put our people on ours. And that's kind of how it works.
As a freshman, do you feel like you have a voice on that committee?
I do, yeah. Our one thing Paul Ryan said to me on his way out, which has borne out to be true, he says that the House is very much a meritocracy. If you have the best ideas and you can sell your ideas, those ideas can carry the day. And so I have experienced that to be true, especially on things like cryptocurrency, AI, sort of this next generation technologies. That's ripe for folks in our generation to lead on, and I've been able to do that.
I want to get back to technology in a second. I think that's the biggest weakness in my observation, in terms of our elected officials really understanding the world of technology. We've seen that in their responses on the Hill, so let's get back to that. But Alyssa, what did you decide? How did you decide what committee you wanted to be in? Or do they invite you? What is it like?
It's a similar, in the Pentagon, when we call it a gonculator. It's like no one really knows what goes on in the machine. Like you put the stuff in and someone cranks it and it comes out. But I didn't use candy, although I will next time, clearly. But you sort of request certain committees and you make your case. Ours is in writing. And I got on the Armed Services Committee and the Homeland Security Committee. So those are committees that make perfect sense for my background. So the system is rational. Again, I do not, we have 15 new members on the Armed Services Committee, and almost new.
How many people are total on that committee?
Almost 55 or 60.
Okay.
It's a very large committee, so we have, I think, 15 or 16 new, and almost everyone who's new has some sort of, either they're a veteran, former intel, they've served in a civilian capacity at the Department of Defense or at the State Department. Like the expertise that comes from a generation, a new freshman class, who, I mean, Anthony and I certainly was never thinking about running 3 years ago. And that is typical of the rest of the Democrats in the freshman class. So if you take a bunch of people who are in very disparate careers, succeeding, doing things, and then they just decide to run, that's a very different lawmaker than someone who had been working their whole life to get in Congress, and once they're there, they're in, and they just like chill, and they're there for 25 years. Right? So the freshman class has brought a level of expertise that I think was desperately needed in Congress.
We'll get to the fact that you're already starting to run again in a minute also, which has got to be really complicated because I'm already getting emails from a woman in Colorado who's going to run against Scott Tipton, and she ran last time. I mean, really? They're just in 7 months. Let's give them a chance. But Elisa, do you have more than one committee assignment?
I'm also on science, space, and technology.
And
Homeland Security and Armed Services, which are two separate.
Okay, so if I recall, the passion that you had becoming a congresswoman was healthcare.
Yeah.
How do you participate in that debate if you're not on a committee that deals with that directly? Or
So
are
interesting you should ask. So there's a hierarchy of committees, and there's something called A-level committees, which are like the top ones, which unsurprisingly are the committees that deal with resources, right? So Ways and Means, which does tax policy, or Appropriations, which appropriates the money. Those are A-level committees, and they do not allow freshmen on those committees. Okay. So actually, I might have had something to do with this. I organized 46 freshmen to write a letter to Speaker Pelosi saying, hey, I think freshmen should be able to get on these committees. I will be the first one to say I don't have the background, but let's just remember one of the freshmen in our class is Donna Shalala, who was the former head of Health and Human Services for 8 years. Like she is not allowed to work technically on a committee that does healthcare policy because she's a freshman. I think that's bonkers. So I made my voice known.
What committee is she on, just out of curiosity?
I don't know what Donna's committees are, but they are not one of the primary healthcare committees. So next year, I'm sure she'll get on one. But this is just we organized that letter in the first week of orientation, right? The freshman class is ready to go.
Well, let's get to that because clearly for the House of Representatives, now Democrats in control, Nancy Pelosi, some criticize, a lot of people, probably I would fall into this, pretty impressed that she's held it together. A number of people calling for impeachment, a number of other people saying, no, we have other work to do. A lot of Americans saying, can we move off? Just curious, where are you in the House being part of this? It sounds like internal contention about what the House's responsibility is right now. And should we legislate? Do we move along? Is it just Jerry Nadler's committee doing what its committee does and it gets all the media attention? Explain a little bit about the dynamics there.
Yeah, and I can only speak for myself here, but I think that she has a very tough job trying to manage these different voices, even just among the Democrats. It's a real challenge. So I think it's important that we recognize how tough the job is. I personally just think that if we're going to take the country down such a huge process like impeachment, we have got to bring the country along with us. And right now it is a conversation in the media and among elites and not in the center of the country. I get letters about this kind of on both sides of it, but people believe that we will absolutely grind to a halt on anything that helps their lives. You know, I get stopped in the grocery store every single time I go by someone clutching me saying they can't afford their child's insulin or they couldn't send their daughter to camp because they couldn't afford enough inhalers that she needed. Mm-hmm. That's what they're talking about, right?
And that's what they want to hear from you.
And that's what they want. It's not just hear from me. They want to get something done. They're like, help me, help me. And it's, you know, it is, people want you to hear their pain and do something about it. So it is very hard to turn to them and say, I know that's what you and everyone you know is grappling with, but the House is now focused on this impeachment question. It's not that they know that Russian engagement in our political process is a bad thing. If you ask them, they'll say yes. But they want help with what they are dealing with right here, right now, and we owe them that.
What do you think, Anthony? You're in the minority part of the House now.
Well, the minority is no fun, as you can imagine. I mean, you're basically at the will of what the majority party is doing. And you know, in terms of where the focus has been, obviously I don't support the impeachment proceedings for a whole host of reasons, and I'm happy to get in with folks offline about that. But having said that, my focus has been, as a minority member, the reality of my situation is I need the other side of the aisle to work with me if I'm going to get anything done for my community. There is no unilateral, like Anthony Gonzalez Republican bill that's going to get through the House and the Senate and to the president's desk. That will never happen. And I don't know that that would even be healthy to have one party rule everything. So that being said, I focus on the areas of agreement and the areas where we can say, okay, do we agree on this problem set? Is this something that we can talk about? Great, let's start working on it. And on top of that, kind of separately, I also work on these things where I call it sort of the 21st century vision of conservatism for the Republican Party on areas like healthcare, where I don't think we've had a coherent policy maybe in my entire lifetime. I work on things like infrastructure. I work on things like trade, education policy, things that I think we need to push our country and our communities forward. I do that kind of separate from the legislation. in hopes that we can win the battle for ideas.
How do you actually work on these issues with people on the other side of the party line?
Well, I mean, we've built up a strong relationship in just the first few months. During the shutdown, so we didn't talk about that. We walked into the largest government shutdown in American history. That's how we entered Congress.
Because you had nothing, literally, you had
Yeah.
time to actually sit down and say, what are we going to do about this in the future? Like, how did you know to reach out to each other?
I don't know
How
we
does
figured out how to reach out to
bipartisanship
each other.
begin to build?
So, literally, we walk in, the government is partially shut down, and we're all meeting each other. In my experience, what is always the easiest on bipartisanship is people who have a common experience. So there are 10 of us in the freshman class who are service or veteran folks, right? Either former intel or former military. And we were able to very easily have meetings and conversations and happy hours with the veterans and former intel folks on the Republican side of the aisle. That's a comfortable space for us. So for me, that's how it started. And then I think a group of us just felt like we have this government shutdown. It's good for no one, right? And we don't know each other. So let's have a freshman conversation across the table about how we think this ends and what we would do about it and what do we think about future government shutdowns. And somehow we got in that same group together. And it was some of the most productive and positive time in our first month or 6 weeks.
Are you around a table?
Literally
Are you at
around a
lunch
table,
Literally
tables?
around
in
a
an
table.
agriculture room. Like we
Yeah.
borrowed a room
Yeah.
and we sat around a table and we organized it. And the strength of just asking, you figure out really quickly who wants to be bipartisan.
Yeah.
Because you'll ask someone, hey, you want to come to this thing? It's 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans. And some people on both sides of the aisle are like, no thanks, that's not my bag. Yeah. And for some of us, it's like, oh yes, good. I really want to be a part of that and meet freshmen on the other side of the aisle. Yeah. You figure those folks out real quick. Mm-hmm. And then you just literally start meeting,
Yeah.
and we started talking about ideas.
And I think for me, the big one was so that the principals weren't talking. Like that, my perspective was that was a leadership-driven shutdown. And leadership wasn't talking, right? The administration, House and Senate Republican leadership, and Democrat House and Senate leadership were not speaking. Where I come from, you don't solve problems if you don't talk to people.
Anyone comes from.
Yeah. I don't know how you solve anything without speaking. So we had this bipartisan group, and in there, not only there's a self-selection mechanism there for sure, but then inside the dialogue, you can say, okay, I think I know who I'm going to be able to work with on this. And so I called Alyssa one day and just said, hey, here's an idea that I have. What do you think about it? And then we had really honest, trusting conversations that we could kind of keep amongst ourselves to try to work together. It didn't manifest itself on that bill, but it did later on this task force, which we announced yesterday.
So let's talk about that, because this is pretty exciting. So they have announced a task force, and it has to do with election security. Before you got here, we had some big sessions on election security. There's a lot of sentiment in America that we're not taking it as seriously as we need to, and I just really would love you to explain to the audience what you guys are doing together as freshmen, Republican and Democrat congressmen trying to do something to improve our election process. So who wants to start?
Sure. So we got together, frankly, not because of the Mueller report, but frankly because the takeaway for so many people on that report was, let's talk about the president's role and what he did or did not do. But there's a whole half of the report that just basically depicts Russian information warfare against our political system. And from what we could tell, no one in Congress, previous Congress or current Congress, had actually been working on legislation to close some of the holes that made us super vulnerable to that information warfare. So we got together. Anthony had, frankly, it's, I think, a very similar idea, and came up to me on the floor and was like, do you think we should be having conversations about this? I'm like, yes, let's do it. And we got together a group, and unsurprisingly, it's a group of a lot of former intel folks, former veterans with Russian policy background, people from tech industry, people who are on the Homeland Security Committee who have an interest in this. And we met in private every week. It didn't leak, which is like a miracle for Washington. And we came up with a suite of legislation that closes holes, that are just glaring in our system that allow, for instance, Russians to, buy ads on social media that are for or against a candidate in the American political system.
Can you describe what some of the holes are so that everybody understands?
So that was one. Another one is this notion that there are two Russian government-controlled media enterprises, Sputnik and RT. RT stands for Russia Today. And they are at liberty to run free reign throughout this country. So I was driving in to my office one day, and I'm listening to this story, and it's this incendiary story about a hate crime in the South. I forget which state. I mean, it was just awful. It was just the worst thing you could imagine, right? And I'm listening. I'm like, man, this sounds terrible.
What station was it? Just out of curiosity.
Sputnik. And I had no idea. And so I get in, and they announce it, at the commercial break, you're listening to Sputnik Radio. Sputnik is designated by the U.S. government as a foreign agent, okay? And we have laws that allow them to do this without disclosing that they're controlled by the Russian government. And so one of the things that we're going to propose is disclosure, which says, look, RT and Sputnik, if you're going to do this, Alyssa has a great quote, like there's going to be a big fat disclaimer every time you do this so that the American people know that they're listening to Russian propaganda. Like that just seems basic.
Yeah, basic.
Right? And so that, and by the way, RT is on like every single hotel station cable package throughout the country. And so this is real. And by the way, when I went and looked up that story, when I tried to corroborate it when I got back to my office, complete nonsense. It didn't happen. I couldn't find it anywhere. It was only on Sputnik.
So I'm just sorry. When I drive to, I listen to NPR just because.
Shocker.
So what
Shocker.
channel are you on that is actually putting Sputnik News?
I had no idea. So I don't live in DC. I'm not from DC. So I was just like scrolling through the radio, and I heard what sounded like news. I was like, listen to this.
On something like Sirius Radio, where you could get it.
Yeah, it was like 98.6 or something. I don't know which one it was, but
That's
I think the
really
point is like it's just there, and you stumble upon it.
So it's not exactly obfuscated by, say, a social media site where you might. It's actually on our airwaves.
Yeah.
Their story.
It's on our airway. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, but then on the platforms, it's amplified, right? So because we all know that the more incendiary the story, the angrier the perspective, the more it gets amplified in our social media space. And so RT and Sputnik, they're on social media. They're getting promoted all over the place. And these stories, again, they are propaganda. These are entities that are controlled by the Russian government.
So the number 3 of Facebook said that for what they believe the low price of $100,000 worth of social media ads on Facebook, they got to 129 million Americans. And Michigan, swing states are particularly targeted. So I've seen these ads, right? You can go to sites and look at these ads, and they're horrible. They're divisive. They create fake organizations.
Social media ads.
Social media. And they create fake organizations, scare you. They had created fake protests, and people showed up to the protest. Can you imagine?
Yes.
That's a Russian-affiliated organization in St. Petersburg that is organizing protests in the United States, and people are showing up. So there is this whole world out there of information warfare, which through our group, we had speakers come in every week. We had the former head of security at Facebook. We had academics who traced sort of how the Russians influenced elections before the Cold War ended. And it turns out, they've been doing this for a long, long time, but the advent of social media gives them this huge opportunity to change up the game and be much more effective.
So we got the one piece where they have to identify themselves.
Yeah.
And what's an example of another piece on the legislation that is?
So first of all, I have an ad or a bill that says if you're a foreigner, you cannot buy an ad for or against a candidate in our system. Just plain, right? We've talked about disclosure, right? Just making sure that there's labels that goes for things that are created by Russians or other foreign actors, but also bots, right? If it's a bot, if it's not a human being that is pushing out that message and amplifying it, then it should be labeled, this was sent to you by a non-human bot. I mean, something like that. So a lot of it is about disclosure. Registration of any of these sort of entities and making sure that we know who they are when they come in the country and what they're about. Trying to remember the other pieces of it.
Well, so there's one on financing where we have these different PACs throughout the country, and all we're saying is, look, if you're accepting foreign dollars, those dollars have to be segregated
Can't be
out,
used in
and you can't use them in an election. And I think the whole point of this is, like, I think if we were to sit down with 100 Americans pulled from all over the country and we explain this, they'd all go, yeah, we probably shouldn't have that. Like, this shouldn't be partisan. This is a nonpartisan conversation. And that's what drew me to this from the beginning, and why I wanted to work with Alyssa, because we've done this before and built up some trust. And it just said, hey, look, let's focus on these things that every American would look at and say, yeah, I don't think Sputnik should be able to just run free reign throughout the country without having to disclose that they're an arm of the Russian government. Let's keep foreign dollars out of our election system for and against a candidate. I don't think that's controversial, and so that's why we wanted to focus on it.
To the question, we came up with a suite of legislation, and we believe, because things are always a little touch and go on what will go to the floor when, but there will be a bill that includes a bunch of these things as amendments that will pass as early as mid-July.
Wow.
And by the way, that would be the first legislation that would pass since 2016 that would actually make us safer in our next election.
And it's coming from freshmen. I think that's worthy of So there's a press release on this, which I could distribute to you all more,
riveting.
but I know we only have about 7 minutes left, so I thought I would open it up to questions. So right here, this woman here in the striped shirt.
You are exceptional people, and you have really given me hope about the future of our government. And I would like to, I'd like to know what you think about term limits.
Yeah.
I'll go first. So first off, thank you for the
Did you
compliment.
hear the question? The question is, what do you think about term limits?
So I was somebody prior to getting into, and this will sound self-serving, but I swear it's not. Prior to getting into this, I thought we probably should have term limits, and I'm okay with them if we're talking, maybe 16 years or something like that. But I know that sounds crazy. But the reality is, if you had a short term limit, let's say 6 years, all you do is empower lobbyists, because by the time you figure this place out, you're out. And so, because it's hard to figure Congress out. I liken it to like a dynamic Rubik's Cube that right before you kind of solve it, it changes on you. And like they add a bunch of colors or something. And so it's a really hard thing to get right. And what I think you want, what I want is for the right people who are in it for the right reasons to be empowered to legislate and to fight for what's right for the country. Term limits in some sense can help flush out some bad folks, but you're also going to flush out some good folks. And so I think the goal should be to make sure that we're promoting as many great candidates as humanly possible.
Okay, I know there's a question over there, sir, with the white shirt.
How can we control lobbyists? What can we do to take special interests out of politics, the money that's flowing in? Any opportunities, anything that you have seen so far that could be helpful?
It is difficult. I will say, and this is just for me, it became very hard for me to understand how to do that for me personally without saying no to corporate PAC dollars. And so I made that decision a year ago in the middle of my campaign, and it was, for me, I just didn't want someone in my district to question what I was doing when I was pushing a piece of legislation. And that doesn't mean that everybody is bought and sold. It just means, for me, it was important to separate myself from those interests.
And again, my perspective on this is it comes down to the individual elected member, right? Like there's a very distasteful way to be in elected office, and that is to basically say, okay, I'm going to take the positions that are going to raise me the most money and keep me the safest, and that's how I'm going to be, right? And I think that's for the folks who maybe they've been here for too long or whatever it is, you kind of know it when you see it, I'll say that. There's a different way of doing it, which is how I try to do it, and I'm sure it's shared, which is here's where I am, these are my positions, let's sell the positions, and people will naturally gravitate towards it. And if they want to contribute, I'm happy to have them. If they don't, that's fine too. But my politics aren't for everyone. That's totally fine. But I think it's really incumbent upon the individual member to make the right decision, and you can't legislate that, I don't think.
I'm going to both sides of the aisle. I just want you to know. Let's see, Judy, you, white.
So I'm really impressed with this election security bill that you're talking about. But the biggest obstacle, it seems to me, is not going to be getting it through the House. It's going to be getting it through the Senate. And I'd like to know, having been in the House now for 6 or 7 months or whatever it is, how you look at the Senate as an institution that is essentially blocking an awful lot.
Well, I have a problem with it. This
I have
not.
less of a problem with it.
But it's your bill too. It is your bill too.
Right. I think that I would say, and I would say this whether we had a Republican majority or a Democratic majority in the Senate. I think it is the job of the Senate Majority Leader to introduce bills and give them a fair up or down vote. The Senate is Republican, so the majority of things that we pass through the House maybe won't pass, but I believe they deserve their day in court. And I would say the same thing if Harry Reid was blocking votes on bills coming out of a Republican House, right? So I have concerns about it. What we have tried to do is reach out to senators on the other side of the aisle, on both sides of the aisle, to have them ready to catch the bill. That is the most effective way to get something done in this system, is to make friends. And in my case, like, I've been working with Lindsey Graham, and we have a lot of things we don't agree on. But on national security issues and on this issue, he's pretty good on this stuff. So we've had phone calls about this. He knows it's coming. There's a bunch of senators on the other side who are ready to pick it up. Now, I've certainly been hit from my left saying, like, well, how can you work with folks who do all these bad things? I am a pragmatist. Like, if it's going to help us and keep us more safe, I will happily work with people who are doing the right thing on legislation that I believe in.
How many, just quickly, and we'll take another question. How many people are putting forth this bill, and are they equal in terms of Republicans and Democrats putting forth this bill?
How many is it? What we're doing is, I think it's 6 Democrats. Right now, I am the one Republican who has been working on this. I will say, I think a lot of that has to do with time and not, like, folks just didn't have the time to do it as opposed to interest. We've had, I would say, 4 to 5 other freshmen or people who maybe are in their second or third term on my side who are interested and are ready to support it. So I don't know that it'll be 50-50, but it won't be completely lopsided.
Right in front?
How do you both come in with this idea of advancing bipartisanship, yet you have to get reelected. How do you do that when you need to rely on the party and those who are entrenched and who don't necessarily go along with bipartisanship? So then how do you advance the ideas that you guys want to work on together?
My voters want me to be bipartisan.
Me too.
Like, they don't, I think you summed it up perfectly. Like, they see social media, they see cable news, they see the dialogue, they see the rhetoric, they're completely disgusted by it. They just want me to focus on the issues that are great for Northeast Ohio, and they don't care who I work with. They just want it to work for Northeast Ohio. And that's what I ran on. And that was, and so on that front, it helps to be bipartisan.
So me too, I have a mandate, and we're both in a group called the Problem Solvers, which is equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans. You literally walk in like Noah's Ark. You have to go in with a Democrat and a Republican to walk into the ship. So my voters, like, that made news in my district. We put out a press release and people were happy about it. And then in terms of how my party may see it, there are plenty of people in my party who don't believe in working across the aisle. That's great. You can be morally pure and get nothing done. And then I would love to bring them, to introduce them to the woman in the grocery store who's crying because her son is rationing her insulin. Go forward and be pure.
I'm going to ask the last question, and I know we're just at time if you have to leave, but we talk about this a lot at the Institute. When you are elected, are you elected to represent your district or to represent the nation? Make the best decisions you can as elected representatives in the halls of Congress for laws that represent everybody, or just Ohio, just Michigan?
I mean, both, right? Like, there's not a clear answer to that, but I overwhelmingly, so, like, people say country over party. I say district over party. Like, I was born and raised in Northeast Ohio. My father immigrated here from Cuba. Northeast Ohio and this country have given me and my family an unbelievable opportunity to live the American dream. And we're trying to make the absolute best of it. And I will do anything to make sure that that stays the case. And my priority, because I'm from Northeast Ohio, I live there, that's where I'm always going to be prioritizing my thinking in terms of the bills I'm working on and the things I'm pushing.
So the answer is both. That is legitimately both. And I believe the body is meant to provide a check and balance on other pieces of the American government, but it is also to put forward legislation that helps people's lives. So literally last week, 2 of the bills that I introduced, or 2 of the things I worked on, one was a very discrete amount of money for farmers and suicide prevention, because in the Midwest right now, because of the weather, people are literally thinking this is the end of their lives. They're the end of their livelihoods. So we put in money that's very specific to my district, right? To a few other districts. The same time, I worked on a bill that said the President of the United States cannot use the 2001 authorization of military force to go to war with Iran without coming back to Congress. I don't get a ton of requests for that in my district. That wasn't a specific thing that I heard about at my last town hall, but I believe for the good of the nation, certainly as a military wife, that we needed to be very clear on that. So I literally walk that walk and talk that talk every single week, I'm sure, as does Anthony.
Yeah, it's both. I mean, you can't, you're always doing both. So, yeah.
Representative Gonzalez.